So I'm delighted to introduce our next speaker, Criostoir King, and Criostoir is a student of the BA in European Studies. And over to you, Criostoir.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So I actually completed my FYP last year. I'm actually graduated. My supervisor sent this on to me as an opportunity to present. So I'm actually no longer a student. I'm actually a graduate. But okay, so my study was called An Analysis of Socioeconomic Status, Values and Environmental Attitudes in the European Social Survey. And it was basically a sociological study of environmental attitudes and the role that socioeconomic status and values play in shaping them. So I'm just going to give a quick introduction and go into a bit of the background of the motivation for this research topic. So this graph that you see on the screen here is taken from the 2000 report on climate change by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in which their estimate, which some argue is more of a conservative estimate just because of the consensus forming nature of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And this estimate was that we need to globally reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 45% below 2010 levels by 2030 in order to cap temperature rise at 1.5 degrees Celsius above 1990 levels, and that we would then need to transition to zero emissions by 2050. Excuse me. So this is obviously quite an enormous task that's going to require an awful lot of change in how we live our lives. And that's going to require huge public support. So you cannot ignore the social aspects of this transition. So that was what really sparked my interest in looking at attitudes towards climate change. And then I was also inspired by, around the time that I was forming the idea for this project, a huge rise in social movements calling for faster and fairer climate action, such as Greta Thunberg's school strike for climate, Friday for Future, and Extinction Rebellion. And I also became aware of a lot of debates and rhetoric in the media about environmentalism as kind of a middle-class issue, a middle-class white bias in the environmental movement. So criticisms that it was just disproportionately comprised of white middle-class members and that it ignores working-class concerns and issues. Some critiques that that environmentalism as a concern is a privilege for the affluent in more developed societies. And these here are just screenshots from various newspaper articles from more conservative and more progressive newspapers on this subject. So some that kind of outline it as a direct attack on the working class, and others that kind of argue that it's more middle class members who tend to maybe vote for green parties or get involved in movements such as Friday for Future or Extinction Rebellion. So this rhetoric around class conflict in environmentalism was quite worrying for me, because if we're to make the jump that the IPCC outlines that we need to make, it's going to require a huge level of public support from everyone. And if we're generating this kind of class conflict, to me, it seems like that's going to be a huge impediment to this progress. So I wanted to study whether or not there were differences between socioeconomic groups in terms of their attitudes towards climate change. So I'm just briefly going to go into the relevant literature that I reviewed for this project. And the first one and the main one is the new childhood argument of Robert Inglehart. So he based this idea on his idea of post-materialism. And post-material values are values that put self-expression and quality of life above economic and physical security. So he argued that in the post-World War II era, so the generation that was born or grew up post-World War II hadn't experienced the shortage and scarcity of that time. He referred to this as the new class, and he argued that this new class had more post-material values because they didn't have the same shortages and scarcity and kind of insecurity in their childhood years. And then he argued that these post-material values fed into various social movements such as environmentalism. And in 1995, he did quite a comprehensive study on the factors that motivate environmental concern. And he found that there's two main motivations. One is objective environmental problems, and he referred to this as the challenge response model. And this was more common in developing societies. And the other one was the subjective cultural values, which means basically the presence of post-material values. And this was more common in more affluent, richer societies. This has also been widely criticized by many for being kind of a Western stereotype of the global South, that this idea could have adverse impacts in policy making, and that maybe some argue that affluence has an impact on behavior, but not actually on attitudes or environmental values. Another important piece of literature that I reviewed informed the question was the work of Eckersley, who argued against Inglehart's new childhood argument. And she argued that values do not only come from the satisfaction of material needs during childhood, but also from post-childhood factors such as education. And she argued particularly that education has an important role in socialization and is not just an indicator of socioeconomic status. So she points to the higher education of this, what Inglehart calls the new class, and their relative autonomy from the production process as reasons that they might have different values to the working class. So these two theories are what I mainly wanted to measure and what I based my research questions off. So going into the methodology and my research question, my research question was, is there a socioeconomic gradient in attitudes towards climate change? And if so, what role do values play in it? So I wanted to know, does socioeconomic status impact directly on values, which then in turn impacts on environmental attitudes, or does socioeconomic status impact directly on environmental attitudes without values really playing an important role? So I performed a secondary quantitative data analysis using, and my source was the European Social Survey. So there's actually a data analysis tool on the website of the European Social Survey, which I then used to carry out bivariate and multivariate regression analysis. And this tool will then calculate the beta coefficient for you, which you can then use to measure the strength of a relationship between a dependent and independent variable. So as I said, the source was the climate change module from the 8th round of the European Social Survey in 2016. And you can see here the measures of socioeconomic status and the measures of attitudes towards climate change that I used. And in as indicators of values, what I used were based on the Schwartz theory of basic human values. So there was many questions based on this theory asked in the European Social Survey, and they can be grouped into conservation values and self-transcendence values. So the conservation values were used in my study as indicators of material values, and self-transcendence values were used as indicators of post-material values. And regression was used as it's a good way of identifying causal relationships and determining their strength. So I'll give you now a brief summary of the most important findings of the study. So firstly, I found support for Inglehart's theory of post-materialism, which is the basis of the new childhood argument. So indicators of socioeconomic status, of higher socioeconomic status, were associated with having post-material values, and lower socioeconomic status was more strongly indicated or associated with having material values. So this is the first part of the argument, that affluence is more associated with higher affluence associated with post-material values. Then secondly, I also found support for the importance of education, as Eckersley would have pointed out. So education has a direct influence on relationship with values, which is independent of socioeconomic status. And it was also found that education, higher education, was associated with stronger support for climate action and concern about climate change. Then thirdly, I also found support for Inglehart's new childhood argument, in that higher levels of post-material values were associated with stronger support for climate action and concern about climate change. However, bear in mind, this study did not test Inglehart's challenge response model. It only tested kind of the importance of subjective cultural values and post-material values. And just to conclude, values explain some but not all of the effects of socioeconomic status on attitudes. So I found some support for Inglehart, but I will just discuss that further in the next section. So I firstly want to just discuss the role of values in this whole topic and in this study. As I previously said, I found that higher socioeconomic status was associated with holding post-material values, and post-material values were also strongly related to your attitudes towards climate change in most cases. But does that mean that socioeconomic status has an impact on attitudes on its own, or is it a result of post-material values? So as we found, there's a direct relationship between socioeconomic status and environmental attitudes, which is independent of values, but there's also a relationship which is a result of values. So one explanation for this is that some indicators had a purely economic element, such as do you support a carbon tax? And that, for example, regardless of your values, if you don't have the financial means to pay higher taxes, you might not be likely to support it. But the study definitely can conclude that there are differences between attitudes between different socioeconomic groups, which are worth investigating. And just lastly, I want to discuss the importance of framing in this entire issue. So it's important to bear in mind that there are different motivations for environmental concern. Two people can be concerned about the environment for different reasons, and two people can have different attitudes towards one issue, but that does not mean that they value the general principle of environmentalism differently. It's also important to bear in mind the indicators that were used in this study are specific to climate change, which in a developed affluent society can still be considered like not objective environmental threats, more of an abstract global issue, because it's not directly impacting on people's lives that much yet, although it is starting to. And it is in other poorer parts of the world. So that's not useful in measuring the challenge response model. So excluding objective environmental threats from the study could exclude issues which disproportionately affect the less affluent, for example, air pollution. So we cannot interpret simplistically, and there's a possibility for difference in priorities between social groups. It can also be argued that the questions used here had a middle class bias. For example, not every environmentalist would agree that a carbon tax is a good environmental policy. That's more controversial. And then lastly, what I really want to emphasize is the framing of environmentalism more generally. So the social sciences have often been critiqued for framing the environmentalism as a luxury good, something which the more affluent can afford to worry about. And this framing has also been common in the media and the general public's understanding of environmentalism. And some, for example, Bell in 2020 argue that the environmental movement has become captured by middle-class members, their priorities and their understanding of environmentalism. And this could possibly turn off working-class people from environmentalism over a longer period of time, which could influence people's attitudes towards it. So just in conclusion, there are different understandings of environmentalism, and maybe the social sciences, including this study, have been guilty of focusing only on one. But there are definitely differences found between those of different socioeconomic groups, which should be investigated further and addressed if we are to develop fair and effective climate policies which get broad public support. So that's just a quick bibliography for references used in this PowerPoint. And thank you very much for your attention and for having me here today. And I'm willing to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Criostoir, and it's wonderful to have you here. And thank you for sharing your